You know what that was? That was rock and roll. But not just rock and roll, that was the history of rock and roll. All of it, the whole thing. Got that? Good. We're done here. Okay, yeah, that one might be a little difficult to understand. Let's get a little more in depth with that. Introducing... In order to get a grasp on the history, let's take a second to get a hold of what rock really is. And at face value, it seems pretty simple. Most of what you'll see is in 4/4 time, with a couple of guitars, a bass, drums, maybe even a keyboard, and whatever strange vocal magician they could find leading the pack. On the musical genre alignment chart, it falls somewhere around here, and whenever people think about rock, they have an instant idea of what it is. And yet, as simple as it seems, we see a strange diversity in the sound of rock throughout the ages, which gives us a cavalcade of subsections like blues rock, power metal, glam rock, punk rock, death metal, alternative rock, dance rock, this rock, the rock. Wait, no, hold on, I don't think that one's right. Are we allowed to do that? Oh yeah, right. And many more. The variety is in part due to the changes and influences to the standard formula made by artists like the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, Talking Heads, the Beatles, The Who, Nirvana, Queen, Black Sabbath, and the artist we'll be looking at first in... If you want to talk about the big-ticket artists of the 50s, Elvis Presley is most certainly going to be at the forefront, and it's no surprise. He had the moves, his music had the grooves, and he had the looks to get all the young people interested. With hits like Jailhouse Rock, he most definitely had a hand in bringing what was known as rock and roll to the mainstream eye. But the truth is, if you want the real news on who started the phenomenon, we have to look a little farther back than the king. The US had just come out of a war with a few very ungroovy countries, and the times were tight. Entering the 50s, people saw a lack of the jazz and swing bands they were used to, and in that void rose legendary artists like Chuck Berry, who put together songs with cheaper, smaller bands that included newfangled electric guitars that all the kids were into. The popularity of his hits like Maybelline and Johnny B. Good allowed a new type of music that both black and white demographics ate up, and set the stage for Presley's success. And because of these artists, the early world of rock and roll explodes into the 60s. The next great influence in rock and roll came from a pretty unlikely place, Great Britain. There were many legendary artists from across the pond in the 60s, but the most influential of those are the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Both bands were part of an early 60s phenomenon known as the British Invasion, which saw many of these foreign artists making headlines in a section of music that was otherwise chiefly American. The Beatles put out songs like rock and roll music, which had a unique sound that once again transformed what people expected of rock and roll. The Rolling Stones were the same way. Albums like Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street had fans raving for more of that Liverpool sound. But there was also a second juggernaut sound among the 60s, psychedelic rock. Beginning as a Southern California style, psychedelia was pioneered by artists like Jimi Hendrix and the Beach Boys, but mainly my boy Jimmy. Characterized by bright colors and trance-like sounds, and maybe a little LSD, this genre got a massive kickoff in the mid to late 60s. But with Hendrix's untimely death in 1970, the subgenre fell out of the mainstream eye. It's through these influences that we dive into the innovations of the next decade. The 70s is considered by many to be the golden era of rock music, and for good reason. Beatlemania had just ended, and though the four members went on to separate careers, none of them had the unending fame that the original group did. This left a void in the music world to be filled. The even greater spread of radios to cars meant that people could listen to music wherever they wanted. And listen they did, to the time's greatest artists like the Eagles, Led Zeppelin, and Queen. The Eagles and Led Zeppelin had absolutely topped the charts with their hits Hotel California and Stairway to Heaven, respectively. Queen was another huge contender in the game. Using Freddie Mercury's unique talent and bravado, the band brought songs like Bohemian Rhapsody and Killer Queen to the public eye. And just like that, more legends were born. Even in the void of previous music powerhouses, the 70s cemented itself as one of the most stylish, unique... Whoa, hold on, what was that? What? Oh no. Oh no, it's the 80s, please somebody God help! The 1980s was a transformative time in the era of rock music. Where before, the previous generations had to compete with disco for mainstream media appeal, the 80s murdered disco in a baseball field. so the stage was set for mass media domination, and dominate it did. Rock was bigger, louder, and bigger than ever with the introduction of the ever-popular subgenre dubbed hair metal. This era is truly the one where there are almost too many bands to count, with leaders like Def Leppard, Aerosmith, Kiss, AC/DC, Van Halen, and others. In fact, rock became such a mainstream hit at this time that it was hard for any artist that wasn't someone like Michael Jackson to compete. With television bigger than ever before, image and spectacle were a huge factor. The clothes were so shiny and the hair was so big that some older generations found it obnoxious. Songs like Final Countdown, Walk This Way, Livin' on a Prayer, and Back in Black shook the top tables and ended up being masterpieces that were almost as good as a-ha's Take On Me. Man, I love this song. With all this, it's easy to tell that the 80s was an era dominated by performance and theatrics, but all that was about to change in... The 90s were a departure from the 80s in a big way. The times were tense, the hair was real, and the death metal bands were all figuring out how to make their band logos out of sticks and twigs. But to really understand the essence of 90s rock, we have to understand grunge. Alternative rock had just started to gain ground in the late 80s, but when the 90s hit, it came full force. And grunge was a genre never quite seen before by the mainstream media. It looked dirty, it sounded dirty, the concertgoers seemed to have a natural fear of showers, even the name sounded dirty, like a strange combination between the words grime and smudge. The whole genre started out with the debut of Nirvana's album, Nevermind. Their most popular song, Smells Like Teen Spirit, carried the sound and feel of grunge rock into the rest of the decade. At its heart, grunge music was about a generation trying to depart from a demographic plagued by the fear of the recent Cold War. New voices demanded to be heard, with many women achieving long overdue influence and fame in this new era of music. But, as such resistance usually goes, grunge rock had a long battle with the man in charge. Record companies flooded the genre with pop influences to make it more sellable to the general public, and the divide between fans and anti-fans was larger than perhaps any generation previous. Through all that, however, grunge shaped the sound of the 90s rock forever and imprinted its smelly little name in history. Well, there you have it. Through the lens of the decades leading up to today, it's almost obvious to see how they've shaped the music we have from the 21st century and up. Even now, there are many new ways rock has evolved. We have soft rock, emotional rock, acid rock, garage rock, Christian rock, even rap rock. One thing to take away from all this is that no matter how old or young you are, there's always a piece of rock for you to love and appreciate. I do love Take On Me, though.